Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, April 5th, or at least we will be pretending for the next couple of hours that it is Friday, April 5th, 2019. I had to jump into the makeshift studio here at world headquarters of the Kagro in the Morning Show to try and put together a show for you this Friday. I have plenty to do. I'm on the road, traveling. It is admitted freshman visitation days for my eldest son, who is getting ready to ship out. But the decision has yet to be made, and so we're going to be attending a couple of these things, and they tend to happen towards the weekend. This one actually is on Friday during the week. And so now is, I guess, that time of the year when kids have to start skipping out on school as seniors. We have to arrange for this thing to get done right, and we're going to drive out and visit. And an undisclosed secure location that we're going to, and check this one out. And we got a couple more to do. I don't know how many Fridays it's going to take to get the job done, but I think we might be away on the next Friday too, but I'm not really sure. We'll have to check out the schedule and see what time we got to hit the road to make it there on time. Anyway, didn't want to leave you in the lurch, as they say, and without a show, since we have so much in the way of other material that we haven't gotten to in the past couple of days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, millennia. I think it's the last unit of time I actually know the name for. I don't know what comes next. Eons? I have no idea. Anyway, lots to catch up on, and I thought maybe we could use this Friday to get that done. There is a story I've been meaning to bring up, waiting for write-ups on the story itself, but I haven't seen them forthcoming, and not a huge story, so I'm not certain we're going to get them. But a story, a tale that occurred to me as I was reading through my email, actually reading Ryan Grimm's email newsletter that he sends out from time to time that, I guess I've been on his mailing list for quite a while, and I occasionally am able to find time to duck into one of these things and find out a little bit about what's going on. He usually brings some of his newest stories to light, along with links to those stories, but this one hasn't, I don't think, reached print yet. There was just a paragraph or two that he put together here that caught my attention. It begins with a little bit of a discussion of end-of-the-quarter fundraising madness, which usually means, for people like you and me, an email inbox full of fundraising solicitations from various candidates. And he's writing in his newsletter, now that the first quarter of 2019 has mercifully passed, your email inbox might be breathing a little bit easier. Did you get bombarded this past weekend by presidential candidates and members of Congress pleading for money ahead of the deadline? In some ways, I shouldn't complain, because I've been urging Democrats to get away from big money and focus on small donors for years now, and this is what that looks like. But still, man, it's annoying, and that's true. So the story already is set up by a familiar tale, looked at in two different ways, both of which are equally valid. And that's one of the things that's going to come along with the territory of asking candidates to rely on small dollar donors. That's you. They're going to come looking for your money, and you're going to have to make some choices about where you put your resources. But then this next paragraph sets things up even better. The most innovative approach came not from the 2020 candidates, but from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A big fan he is, and so no surprise here. And it is innovative in a way, but of course looked at another way, not at all innovative, but not in a bad way. This just struck me in his characterization that there was another way of looking at these things, maybe because of that first paragraph. So the most innovative approach apparently comes from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who surprised a handful of her colleagues by raising money directly for them from her supporters. It's early, but that's the kind of alternative fundraising structure that could genuinely change the Democratic Party. I'll have more on that later this week, and I'm still waiting for it, or at least I was at the point at which I recorded this. If I'd waited till actual Friday, I might have more. Maybe on Monday we'll have seen this thing develop, unless he's aiming to spoil all my work by publishing such that it might be broadcast during Thursday's show. But by the time you hear this, we will already have seen whether that was the case. So he says he'll have more on that later this week, along with the debate within the caucus on corporate money and the DCCC. And that's been the big news in congressional fundraising lately. Not an easy story to dissect, the basics of that story being that the DCCC, in an effort to, in an effort to help it protect incumbents in Congress, which, remember again, is their actual job, although they do occasionally expand their job to include bringing in new blood, new Democrats to support, expand, protect the majority. The DCCC is, of course, a service organization funded chiefly by the incumbent members of Congress. And to no one's surprise, they view their chief mission as the protection of the seats held by incumbent members of Congress. And while that doesn't exclude supporting Democrats running elsewhere, challenging Republicans for their seats or making a bid for an open seat, and occasionally, though, after the fact, if a Democrat is defeated in a primary, presumably they have at least some interest in, if they don't follow through with it, that's their problem, but they would have an interest in bringing that Democrat in and seeing that they occupy a seat in Congress and expand, regain, or protect a Democratic majority in the House. The controversial part of this all, of course, is that the DCCC has decided to make it a policy, essentially, that consultants who work with candidates who challenge incumbent Democrats during a primary would essentially be blacklisted, would not be recommended. In fact, they would warn candidates off of using a consultant who made a habit of, or I don't know whether how many strikes you get, whether the first strike is you're out, but a consultancy that would work with a Democratic candidate challenging a Democratic incumbent in a primary. And it was, of course, pointed out that, well, for instance, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has had such success in highlighting and featuring prominent parts of a progressive agenda in Washington, and has so successfully defended progressive positions in Washington in a number of since viral clips from hearings or interviews or town hall meetings or what have you. She wouldn't be there but for the fact that she challenged an incumbent Democrat in a primary and then won the seat. So, while I have no particular problem with people challenging incumbent Democrats, it's not my favorite thing in the world. I don't love primaries, but I recognize that there are some Democrats who just really need that push from time to time, and who in fact need to be pushed out so that a better Democrat can take that seat and represent the district better. I mean, if it's a better Democrat, it'll be better representation. What does better mean? Well, that's up to me, let's say, and I'll tell you when I see it. Sometimes, of course, there are primary challenges where I believe the challenger is just worse than the incumbent, but I don't love it, generally speaking, because I like to think the best of all possible, if at all possible, of the Democrats who are incumbent in these seats, and I'm sure the DCCC's thinking on it is not so much about their ideology as the odds of retaining the seat. The odds of winning the seat are best with an incumbent, even when we might all be better off with the challenger taking that seat instead. And in some cases, in heavily Democratic districts, that's a serious possibility. And in marginal districts, perhaps less the case. But it's all just theory. Anyway, so yeah, there are a couple of members that we can be glad are here despite the fact that they started out as challengers, and those members would doubtless be less than happy about this DCCC policy, or at least you could expect them to have been less than happy with it when they were challengers. Of course, now several of them are incumbents. And they don't want to be seen as taking that sort of pro-incumbent stance because they still consider themselves up-and-comers and outsiders and progressive challengers, and they know where they came from. And they don't want to see, I'm sure they don't want to see that sort of passion and enthusiasm. And, where's my enthusiasm?
Enthusiasm.
Yeah, right. Okay. They don't want to see that squashed where you might see up-and-coming progressive-minded Democrats moving into Congress through similar challenges, particularly in seats occupied by people who may have placed themselves as conservative or more conservative obstacles to that progressive agenda somewhere along the line. However, I am sure, because they're human, that at some level they also might appreciate the protection once in a while, even if they feel like, as a committed progressive activist who only lately became a member of Congress, their real allegiance is to the dynamic, the dynamism of a progressive, of a challenge featuring a progressive candidate in a primary. That's where they came from. They'd like to see more of it, just not necessarily in their districts. Keeping in mind, of course, that, like, for instance, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has been threatened with a primary in her district from someone who is presumably a more conservative Democrat, though I guess we don't know who it will be or if there will be one at all. Presumably they'd be looking to back a more conservative person, but I suppose they could say, we want, I guess the perfect candidate would be someone progressive and perhaps a woman of color. And I guess for the people who are uncomfortable with Omar and her approach to representing the district, they would be looking for someone who was otherwise Ilhan Omar, but minus her, her proclivity for commenting in ways that get flagged as anti-Semitism. It's the best way I can put it. So I suppose I guess that would be like the ideal candidate. I don't know if there is such a person, but anyway, they can fantasize about it. And I'm sure at that point, Congresswoman Omar might say, hey, what about this whole thing where you were going to protect incumbents? And, you know the answer to that. When progressives are in the crosshairs, that doesn't apply in the same way, or frequently doesn't. Anyway, so what is it that what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was doing that was so innovative to Ryan's way of thinking? Well, he points by way of evidence to the tweet of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff, whose name I have never pronounced aloud, but is Saikat Chakrabarti. I'm doing my best, and I don't know how well I've done. But anyway, Saikat, which I'm guessing at the pronunciation, I hope I'm not mangling it too bad, tweets about her activities in the closing days of the quarter. AOC's supporters, he says, raised about $90,000 for 3 swing district Dems in a few hours. This is the power of small money fundraising, but it only works if the candidates take strong positions and fight. I'm sure it works better if you do. But anyway, imagine a totally grassroots funded Dem party running all strong fighting candidates. It would take a hell of an imagination. But it's an interesting thought. And he includes here the tweet of Jahana Hayes, who says, I can't thank my friend AOC enough for helping me to reach my Q1 first quarter goal. We rise by lifting others. Onward. And Congresswoman Hayes includes AOC's tweet, which reads, first up in her project here, Jahana Hayes, CT, Connecticut. Jahana Hayes is a former National Teacher of the Year and has been kicking butt in Congress. And there's a whole thread that goes with it. let's see. She ran a tough, bold campaign, and she hasn't shied away from championing children and families. Let's go in and have her back. And, all right. And so she tweets also an Act Blue link for making the contribution. Basically, what AOC is doing here is, let's see who else she picked out. It's a whole thread. Katie Hill in California and Mike Levin, also in California. And she has very nice things to say about the various people for whom she is fundraising. And it's very interesting and noble and a good thing to do. Now, the question for me was whether it was an innovative approach. And it is slightly, to a certain extent. But longtime listeners to the show will no doubt recognize where I'm going with this, which is to say that I feel like this was something I outlined some time ago. One, as a good option for AOC in particular, when she first became a hot property when she won the primary. And she did do a lot of campaigning around the country for other people that she thought shared her progressive agenda. And in some cases, campaigned for people who did in fact lose that primary, and the person they lost to is now a Democratic colleague in Congress. And in some cases, someone that there are people that she gets along with pretty well and is happy to have them as colleagues, which is about as good an outcome as you could ask for. This would be my preference, but I got someone else, and I will work with that Democrat to do our best to put forward a progressive agenda in Congress and, hopefully then later support them in their reelection bid. But this is something I've discussed for a long time, and the reason I don't think it's particularly innovative, though it is a great approach, is when I outlined it, I was in the context of how do progressives get themselves, A, into Congress, but B, stay there, and C, move into leadership positions where they can drive the agenda. We're constantly, of course, fighting about and complaining about the inability of progressives to set the leadership agenda and instead to have to subsume, in most cases, their agenda to the agenda of, well, the Democratic leader in the House, the Speaker of the House now, Nancy Pelosi, who the whole thing is a little bit ridiculous because Nancy Pelosi, for the most part, is very progressive in her own right. So it's a little bit frustrating to deal with that. But everyone can identify places where Nancy Pelosi has either irked progressives or us, if we don't consider ourselves progressives or whatever, or, has taken a position on one thing or another with which we disagree. And, I'm sure everyone's given thought at one time or another to, what could be accomplished if my idea of what the agenda ought to be were to come to pass instead. In other words, if I were allowed to call the shots, if I were able to define what the leadership position for Democrats in the House is on this subject, whether it's the Green New Deal, impeachment, some narrow piece of ordinary routine legislation, take your pick. But as I have reminded people very often, whenever one of these leadership contests is going on, when it's time to make a prediction about who will win, I've always said that the best quick and dirty metric for it is to follow the money. Find out how much money each of the people standing for election to a leadership position has raised for other colleagues. And the easiest online methodology to get that done in a couple of minutes so that you can go on with your life is to check out how much money the leadership PACs associated with the candidates for the leadership position. Again, that's why they're called leadership PACs. That's one is the chicken and one is the egg. The leadership PAC comes before the leadership position, typically speaking. How much money have they used? How much have they donated using the leadership PAC to other colleagues? And if it's a close call and you really need to get down into the fine print, you'll want to look at how many members have they, or how many candidates have they assisted who are actually members, who will be there to vote in the Democratic caucus in favor of the candidate for leadership office who gave them money, who supported their campaigns. Now, there are other ways to support a campaign, to be sure, and some of them are, for instance, you could give money out of your own campaign fund, although you're limited to a smaller amount than you would be with a leadership PAC. Or you could go to their district and campaign for them. You could show up at the fundraisers in their district for them and be a headliner if you're that kind of person and draw in more interest and therefore more money. There's all sorts of things that you can do to help a colleague win. But since we're sticking with the proxy of money, cash, money, and fundraising, we take a look at that. So here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doing this innovative thing, taking to Twitter, social media, that's her bailiwick, and raising money from her supporters, presumably. I mean, that's the way it was phrased, but I guess everybody who might be following her on Twitter, mostly her supporters, I would guess. But her message gets out further than that, and asking people to donate directly to these candidates she's trying to help out, which is essentially the digital equivalent of showing up at one of their fundraisers. So instead of Johanna Hayes having a fundraiser in her district in Connecticut and mailing out invitations to say, special guest, the Honorable Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, and everybody's saying, oh, I like her. She's really interesting. She always has something quotable and fun to say. I will go to that fundraiser to meet her and hear what she has to say, and I'll pay the ticket fee. And more people will do that than would ordinarily be the case, and Johanna Hayes is the beneficiary of it. Taking all of that expense out of it, she's just doing this online. Please give money to my friend. I mean, if she showed up for a campaign event in Connecticut, AOC wouldn't get a cut of the gate or anything. The money goes to the candidate she's campaigning for. Anyway, in that sense, it's not innovative at all. It's very traditional, and it's exactly the sort of path her predecessors in Congress, those staid, stuffy, more conservative-leaning, incumbent, elite, blah, 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 whatever, things you want to, establishment Democrats, all the things that they've done throughout their careers in order to establish their careers, in order to get where they are now. They did this for tens, dozens, hundreds of candidates over their career and spent hundreds of nights away from home. She's found an innovative way to do it without racking up travel bills and being away from family and home. But beyond the fact that it's digital, it's not innovative. That doesn't mean it's not great or not clever or not a terrific thing to do. It is all of those things, and it's fantastic to see her do it. And it was great to see it done in sight of so many interested progressives on social media. I would just like to point out how traditional it is, how effective it can be, and I would love it if all of the progressive supporters of hers who were moved to donate through this action fully understood exactly what it was she was doing and how not different it is from the way Nancy Pelosi became Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer became Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn became Jim Clyburn. Climbing the leadership ranks by doing for others. And really, when it comes to doing for others, bottom line, socialist or not, that means raising money the old-fashioned way. And as demand grows for her help with these projects, what's going to happen is she's going to have to find ways of balancing the demands on her time. One of the things that has made her very interesting and very famous through viral digital video clips that are circulated online has been her performance in the hearings, which many have attributed to the fact that she doesn't skip those hearings in order to do call time, as they call it, going over to the DCCC office and making phone calls for money from big donors, or any donor, really. I don't know that she doesn't do call time, but I guess she does something less of it, or maybe because she's not pursuing the corporate donors, she doesn't use the DCCC's lists, but she's doing call time somewhere, and she's calling small dollar donors, and now she's calling on them digitally for their support for other candidates. Essentially, though, a very traditional thing to do, and as the word of its success spreads, she'll be asked to do it more and more, and you may see her at fewer hearings. She may just decide that's not something I can sacrifice, and instead I will dedicate my evenings to that, which is what she did this time around. And as a single person with no kids and no family to return to and no family time to spend, that's a little easier, and thank God for it. Another good thing, no criticism involved in that. It's just terrific, and maybe, hopefully, it will mean that she can do it all for the time being. But yeah, it's just sort of interesting how this leads even the most resistant, establishment resistant upstart, I guess. I don't know. Is that a loaded term? But an insurgent kind of outsider candidate will find through their own, in their own way, with their own preferences expressed, will find a interesting and somewhat innovative way to do something very, very traditional. And that's because those things that end up becoming very, very traditional become traditional, typically speaking, because they work pretty well. I just thought that was a really interesting way of turning it on its head and taking a look at it from another perspective. And I hope you did too. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Want to shift gears a little bit and bring you this story, which has been waiting in the hopper for a couple of days, but ought to be brought to the fore. Homeland Security disbands Domestic Terror Intelligence Unit. Betsy Woodruff reporting for the Daily Beast here. Subheader: while the body counts from domestic terror attacks mount, the analysts looking into those attacks have been moved. And, of course, gives me an opportunity to reiterate my suggestion that we begin to look for an alternative and do away with the term domestic terror or domestic terrorism, especially with regard to white supremacist attacks, which appear to me to be as international in nature as pretty much any other routine terrorist attack ever is accused of being. And we ought to get rid of the whitewashing of white supremacist terrorism as if it's some other sort of somehow vaguely more acceptable terrorism. I don't know. We'll have to come up with a better argument than that if we hope to actually convince people to do it. But I like to remind everybody from time to time. All right, so Betsy Woodruff's piece here, noting that the Department of Homeland Security has disbanded a group of intelligence analysts who focused on domestic terrorism. The Daily Beast has learned Numerous current and former DHS officials say they find the development concerning as the threat of homegrown terrorism, including white supremacist terrorism, is growing. In the wake of this move, officials said the number of analytic reports produced by DHS about domestic terrorism, including the threat from white supremacists, has dropped significantly. People in and close to the department said this has generated significant concern at headquarters. It's especially problematic given the growth in right-wing extremism and domestic terrorism we are seeing in the U.S. and abroad. Problems with domestic terrorism abroad, eh? One former intelligence official told the Daily Beast. The group in question was a branch of analysts in DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, or I&A. They focused on the threat from homegrown violent extremists and domestic terrorists. The analysts there shared information with state and local law enforcement to help them protect their communities from these threats. Then, the Trump administration's new I&A chief, David Glawe, Glawe, not sure how that would be pronounced, began reorganizing the office, which is the DHS component that has a place in the intelligence community. Over the course of the reorganization, the branch of I&A focused on domestic terrorism got 86th, and its analysts were reassigned to new positions. The change happened last year and has not been previously reported. We've noticed I&A has significantly reduced their production on homegrown violent extremism and domestic terrorism, while those remain among the most serious terrorism threats to the homeland, said one DHS official. Former officials pointed to a spate of domestic terror attacks in recent years as evidence that DHS erred by shuttering this branch. From the massacre that left 11 people dead at a Pittsburgh synagogue to a shooting targeting Republican members of Congress in June of 2017, to bomb threats that a deranged Trump fan directed at prominent Democrats and CNN, violent attacks informed by homegrown hatred have left Americans increasingly terrorized. I mean, actually, the choice of words there, informed by, another entree into the discussion of whether or not this is really homegrown. The people may be homegrown, natural-born American citizens, but very often the terrorist ideology is shared internationally. Reached for comment, a DHS spokesperson provided the following statement from David Glawe, whatever his name is, the chief of I&A. I wish I knew how to pronounce that. No idea. DHS and I&A routinely works with federal partners, including the FBI, state and local law enforcement, and the National Network of Fusion Centers, to gather homeland threat information regardless of a threat actor's ideology. I&A has invested heavily in interagency relationships to enhance analysis on homeland threats, including domestic terrorism, where I&A lacks access to relevant case data and information held by other federal agencies. I&A is also focused on ensuring intelligence production is not duplicative of other agencies and focused on areas where DHS I&A can add the most value through unique data and access within a department. When DHS I&A identifies domestic terrorism threats or related information of value, DHS I&A immediately coordinates it and shares it as widely as possible. That's a lot of bureaucracy speak, but okay. Pressed on whether DHS disputes this reporting, a senior DHS official pushed back. The same people are working on the same issues, the official said. We just restructured things to be more responsive to the I&A customers within DHS and in local communities while reducing overlap with what the FBI does. We actually believe we are far more effective now. But Sergeant Mike Abdeen with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department told the Daily Beast that his office used to receive a significant amount of material from I&A, but that the communications have dried up in recent months. For the last 6 months, he said, I&A has been mostly silent. He added that this has been consistent with broader changes in how the department communicates with his office. It's been very quiet lately, Abdeen said. It's changed with the new administration. It doesn't seem to be as robust, as active, as important. It is important, I'm sure, but it's not a priority. It doesn't seem like engagement, outreach, and prevention are seen as a priority as we used to see it in the past. There were roundtable meetings in the past. There was more activity, more training, more seminars. Now it seems like it's gone away. Current and former officials said I&A must now coordinate with the FBI when sharing information with local and state law enforcement, creating another hurdle. While I cannot speak to what is going on at DHS I&A today, the analysis provided by I&A personnel on domestic extremism was essential during my tenure at DHS, said John Cohen, formerly the acting head of I&A. Based on the current threat environment, I believe those same efforts are essential today. But others defended the change. Two former DHS officials, speaking anonymously because their current employers did not authorize them to speak to the press, said this change eliminates redundancy in the government. These officials argued that the responsibility for preventing domestic terrorism lies with the FBI rather than with DHS. It's not an absurd argument, right? When DHS is writing something that may be terrorist-related, they have to, regardless of whether or not personally they might want to, they have to work with the FBI, said one of those former officials who was based at headquarters and liaised with I&A. And because DHS doesn't really have moxie, and they don't have a history of cultural and operational camaraderie, when state and locals receive a joint product from DHS and FBI, it's more serious, and they know it's well-written and well-sourced. That's a knock. Secretary Kirsten Nielsen, who heads DHS, for the time being anyway, has highlighted the threat of domestic terrorism in the U.S. once. After a terrorist killed 50 people at 2 mosques in New Zealand, she said the same threat exists here. We, too, have seen the face of such evil with attacks in places such as Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, and Charleston, she said in a recent speech. I want to make one thing very clear. We will not permit such hate in the homeland. Too late. But Nate Snyder, a former DHS official who focused on violent extremism, said the department's move undercuts Trump administration claims that it takes domestic terror seriously. Well, I don't know. I mean, if the claim is we take domestic terror seriously, how do we know? That's not a clear enough statement to know whether the department's move undercuts the Trump administration's claims. I mean, they may be claiming we take them seriously as allies and want to foster their development. Then that move would not undercut Trump's administration's claims, would it? You hear the Secretary and this administration say how domestic terrorism is a clear priority and how resources will be bolstered, but you can't say that and then all of a sudden get rid of the unit that's there to detect threats and share information with our first responders, law enforcement, and federal partners, Snyder said. You can't have it both ways. Of course, Gimitarianism tells us you can, or you can say you can anyway. There is an update here at this point in the article. After publication, the DHS Public Affairs Office provided the following statement from Glowy, that guy, to the Daily Beast. The idea presented by some that we have cut our commitment to defeating all forms of radical ideology, including white supremacist and domestic terrorist, that's what it says, is patently false and the exact opposite of what we have done. Those pushing such a narrative either do not understand intelligence collection efforts or don't care about the truth. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis has significantly increased tactical intelligence reporting on domestic terrorists and homegrown violent extremists since 2016. The intelligence shared is actionable and frequently used by partners to take immediate steps of intervention. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis coordinates with the intelligence community and continues to produce strategic and tactical intelligence in partnership with the FBI, who is the lead organization for domestic terrorism and civil rights violations. Additionally, the Department of Homeland Security Office of Intelligence and Analysis restructured in 2018 to drive information exchanges and integrate intelligence into operational functions across all threats to the homeland. This is getting to be a bit long. This restructuring included significant investment in our field operations to work with state and local partners. It also created the Counterterrorism Mission Center to prioritize intelligence production on areas where there is the most value through unique data and access within the department, and avoid duplication of work by other partners to include the FBI. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis also has a robust state and local engagement program whose mission is to ensure that state and local partners can expeditiously access the capabilities, resources, and expertise necessary to share information and intelligence. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis provides a single, reliable, and dependable touch point dedicated to supporting relationships with all of our partners in order to facilitate communications and engagement, conduct outreach, ensure transparency, and address any issues, concerns, and questions. The analysis and coordination with our partners of domestic terrorism and homegrown violent extremism continues 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. It's a hell of an infomercial for the I&A department, and I guess in the end it comes down to the consumers of I&A's output saying there isn't any, and the producers of I&A's output saying yes there is. So which will it be? Or is it possible that Gimmitarianism prevails? And yes, you can have it both ways. You just say you're not stopping, but you stop. I don't know. At this point, Occam's razor might be helpful. With this administration, it seems like they might just be trying to have it both ways. Let me offer you a related story from The Guardian. I relate it in my head anyway. Jason Wilson wrote this piece for The Guardian. It came out on April 1st, so I assume it's not an April Fool's Day joke, but it reads like one. In the beginning, intelligence report appeared to endorse view left-wing protesters were, quote, terrorists. Experts say the report produced before the Charlottesville rally mischaracterizes the dynamics of the street violence. Let's take a look at this. An intelligence report produced for law enforcement agencies in the months before the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, in which a neo-Nazi killed one protester by driving a car into a crowd, appeared to endorse a view that leftist demonstrators were terrorists and at least equally as responsible for street violence as white nationalists, The Guardian can reveal. The report, Antifa/Anti-Antifa, Violence in the Streets, was produced by the Regional Organized Crime Information Center, or ROCIC, in May of 2017. It was obtained with a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, of course, from the nonprofit transparency group Property of the People. Antifa is the name given to groups of left-wing protests. It says, well, I guess protests. I don't know whether they meant protesters or what, who confront white nationalists, often violently. Experts say the report mischaracterizes the dynamics of the street violence that was emerging at the time and is mistaken in characterizing white nationalist groups as anti-Antifa, suggesting they act in opposition to left-wing groups or out of a sense of anarchism rather than having their own political and violent agenda. ROCIC is one of 6 regional intelligence sharing systems, or RISS, a lot of alphabet soup here, centers throughout the country. RISS is a federally funded program designed to share intelligence between federal, state, and local agencies. Sounds familiar, right? ROCIC serves 14 southern states, including Virginia, the site of the 2017 Unite the Right rally. Documents accompanying the FOIA request indicate that the U.S. Secret Service was among the agencies that the report was provided to. The report frames political street violence in America as an evenly poised battle between Antifa, or between Antifas and apostrophe S, like possessive, described as an alliance between anarchists and communists to confront and defeat fascists and white supremacists by whatever means necessary. And, on the other hand, anti-Antifa, a loose collection, they say, of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, Ku Klux Klanners, white identity groups, and a group called the alt-right. Very interesting. A loose collection of people who show up in quasi-uniform, all carrying identically painted shields. Sounds very loose, this collection. The report blames the two sides equally for the violence, of course, because that's the only sensible thing to do. Continuing, so it's the anarchists versus the nationalists, the communists versus the Nazis, the left-wing extremists versus the right-wing extremists, and the confrontations are becoming more violent and destructive. I would find it interesting to sit the authors of the report down with the alt-righters and conservatives who, when it suits them, insist that Nazis were, of course, left-wing, and see if they can hash that out between them. Michael German, who was born in Germany, probably not, but that joke is old now. Michael German, a former FBI agent who infiltrated far-right groups in the 1990s. He could use his own real name if he wanted to. And a fellow now at the Brennan Center for Justice said the report's framing was wrong. And it is. Somehow, they have this set up almost like Antifa is the antagonist and anti-Antifa has developed to resist it, he said. That's exactly how they have it set up. It's almost as if the other side of this equation didn't exist and only came out to protect America from Antifa. And that's, just even dubbing them anti-Antifa is a huge favor for them. All right. Well, anyway, he said, what it seems to do is completely whitewash the history of white supremacist violence in this country. Yeah, I guess it would do that. German said that framing it this way belies the way in which far-right groups use these public spectacles as the method to incite violence, and they come knowing that it will attract protest groups from the community. Such groups intentionally go to places to provoke protesters to come out, and they go armed for a real street fight, German said. I've always wondered why local police tolerate assembly of groups that have come in makeshift body armor with shields and clubs. That I don't know why they allow them to get together without dispersing them immediately. They're an obvious danger to the public, no matter what they claim to have been armored against. Anyway, the story continues here. The report also reproduces an opinion piece by Republican National Committee member Sean Steele on clashes at UC Berkeley in February of 2017, first published in the conservative Washington Times. The excerpted text reads, quote, the mob of Antifa terrorists that violently attacked the student union were as much declaring war on the ideology of the man for whom the building is named, Martin Luther King, by the way, and its citizens. America's left was sending a message, violence is the answer, unquote. That's a hell of a stupid piece to include in a report like this. Unless, of course, you're trying to drive at a certain conclusion. The report takes the description of anti-fascists as terrorists at face value, something many experts disagree with. Mark Bray, a lecturer at Dartmouth College and author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, said the anti-Antifa designation for American far-right groups is also potentially misleading. Yeah, but also, isn't that the whole point of this? I don't get the sense that is the main source of their self-identification, he said. Of course not. The word identity is in the name of at least one of the prominent groups involved. They tell you what their identification is. The report makes further assertions about the relationship between the groups that experts say are unsupported by the facts. At one point, the report says the Antifa can be considered left-wing anarchism, and the anti-Antifa can be considered right-wing anarchism. Bray said, that's ludicrous. most of these right-wing groups are not opposed to the state as a form of social organization. Many of them are fascists of some sort or another and believe in a strong state. Shane Burley, the author of Fascism Today, What It Is and How to Fight It, it's not a newspaper, Fascism Today, agreed, saying that this idea that it's right-wing anarchists, that's not a phenomenon, that's not a thing that actually exists. The report is heavily redacted, of course, why not, but spends much of its unredacted length discussing alleged anti-fascist violence and sometimes implicitly blames those groups for violence visited upon them. At one point, it focuses in particular on an event in Sacramento in June of 2016, which led the FBI to open a controversial investigation on a left-wing group. At that time, groups including By Any Means Necessary, or BAMN, organized a counter-protest against a white supremacist rally which included members of the Traditionalist Workers' Party and the Golden State Skinheads, some of whom were wielding knives. Several people were stabbed at the event, including at least 7 counter-protesters. Following this event, California law enforcement cooperated with neo-Nazis to identify counter-protesters, pursued charges against counter-protesters, including stabbing victims, and did not prosecute neo-Nazis over the stabbings. That makes so much sense. In February, The Guardian revealed that the FBI had responded to the event by surveilling and investigating BAMN. In the ROCIC report, there is also no discussion of the specific groups actively organizing the Unite the Right rally not long after the report's publication date. Neo-Confederate groups such as the League of the South, neo-Nazi and identitarian groups such as Vanguard America, the National Socialist Movement, the Rise Above Movement, and Identity Europa, and street fighting groups such as the Fraternal Order of Alt-Knights. I don't think I had even heard of that one. And the Proud Boys are not mentioned. All of these groups were involved in a demonstration in Charlottesville, which culminated in the killing of Heather Heyer by James Alex Fields, who marched with Vanguard America. The report is also extensively sources information from conservative media and right-wing advocacy groups. It quotes a report from Glenn Beck's The Blaze, which cites the Washington Times, and Laura Ingram's conservative lifestyle website LifeZet, alongside more reputable sources, including The Guardian. Bray criticized the thinness of the report's sourcing. There's a wealth of literature out there about the nature of far-right politics in Europe and the United States. It just sounds like someone got tasked with Googling this, he added. And it sounds like a high school student did that. Ryan Shapiro, the executive director of Property of the People, which sourced the documents, said, U.S. intelligence agencies have a long, sad history of targeting progressive movements as threats to American security. Neither ROCIC nor RISS replied to repeated requests for comment on the report. By the way, if you're interested, as I am, in exactly what the ROCIC is, recall that it operates under the other acronym RISS, and I just looked it up and I thought I'd share with you from the RISS.net website About Us section. It tells us a little bit about what they're up to. The mission of the Regional Information Sharing System, or RISS program, is to assist local, state, federal, and tribal criminal justice partners by providing adaptive solutions and services that facilitate information sharing, support criminal investigations, and promote officer safety. RISS has been supporting the law enforcement and criminal justice communities for more than 40 years. How so, and in what context? Well, aside from all of the jargon about what sorts of things they study and disseminate information on, we have this brass tacks information down here. Congress appropriates funds each year for RISS. The Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA. The Office of Justice Programs, OJP, United States Department of Justice, administers the RISS program. So in other words, it's under the umbrella of the Justice Department. Specifically, I guess, I don't know how the layers go, but I guess DOJ's Office of Justice Programs, under which exists the Bureau of Justice Assistance, oversees the RISS program, which includes among its regions the ROCIC and their efforts among the southern states. So it's a Justice Department thing, not a Homeland Security thing like I&A. So you can clearly see that I suppose there's a lot of places where people would think there is significant overlap, and I'm sure there usually is. It's just one of those bureaucratic things that happens from time to time. But they're not getting it right over at ROCIC. I don't know if I&A is doing any better, but there you have it. And I guess for those who are interested in even more nitty-gritty in the brass tacks section, the RISS centers operate their intelligence system under the Criminal Intelligence Systems Operating Policies, 28 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 23. All RISS member agencies have agreed to comply with the requirements of 28 CFR Part 23 with respect to any criminal information they submit into an applicable RISS Criminal Intelligence Database, or RISS Intel. RISS has adopted a comprehensive privacy policy to protect individual privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, and other protected interests. Brought to you by Peter Paul. Peter Paul, almond joys got nuts, mounds don't. All right, then, time for us to head into another break. Just 1 minute now for the top of the hour, but I thought those were two interesting articles to sort of jam together for a juxtaposition. They're not operating under the same department, but like I said, another interesting illustration of how the bureaucracy sometimes works. We'll be right back with, I've got another two articles to throw together. These two a little bit more directly related, but off the beaten path of politics. Next. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just after our brief break, I told you beforehand that I had another two articles to throw together. They are more directly related. I said they were off the beaten path of politics. They are, of course, political in nature, but off of our beaten path, our usual political beats. Though I do cover, or the story first came to my attention through one of my ongoing Twitter threads of that I usually just refer to as you are really good at getting stuff done or whatever, hashtag Dotard. One of the recent inclusions there reported in the New York Times just the other day. Yes, this one from the New York Times back at the end of last month, March 30th. Coral Davenport reporting Trump's order to open Arctic waters to oil drilling was unlawful, federal judge finds. And now we enter the weird world of Alaskan oil for that one. But just one other instance in which Trump said in his why don't you just ist sort of way, why don't we just open up Arctic waters to oil drilling? Well, judges have something to say about that. In a major legal blow to President Trump's push to expand offshore oil and gas development, a federal judge ruled that an executive order by Mr. Trump that lifted an Obama-era ban on oil and gas drilling in the Arctic Ocean and parts of the North Atlantic coast was unlawful. The decision by Judge Sharon L. Gleason of the United States District Court for the District of Alaska concluded late Friday that President Barack Obama's 2015 and 2016 withdrawal from drilling of about 120 million acres of Arctic Ocean and about 3.8 million acres on the Atlantic coast will remain in full force and effect unless and until revoked by Congress. She wrote that an April 2017 executive order by Mr. Trump revoking the drilling ban, quote, is unlawful as it exceeded the president's authority, unquote. The decision, which is expected to be appealed in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, immediately reinstates the drilling ban on most of the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Alaska, a pristine region home to endangered species such as polar bears and bowhead. Is Is that right? Bowhead whales? It's not bowhead, is it? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, makes sense, right? Anyway, those whales, they know who they are. You know who you are, whales. You're listening to the show. Good morning. How you doing? I don't know whether they make noises like that at all. I'm being speciesist here. Anyway, those endangered species, they live up there. And, of course, that is where oil companies have long sought to drill. Along the Atlantic coast, it blocks drilling around a series of coral canyons that run from Norfolk, Virginia to the Canadian border, which are home to unique deep-water corals and rare fish species. In addition, Friday's ruling by the judge, an Obama appointee, has broader implications for Mr. Trump's effort to push drilling across the American coastline and on public lands. By the way, little-known fact, very few people know this, but the sound of oil drills gives you cancer. Specifically, the Arctic Ocean drilling case could give legal ammunition to opponents of Mr. Trump's efforts to roll back protections for 2 million acres of national monuments created by Mr. Obama and President Bill Clinton. The case adds to a growing roster of legal losses, yes, of course, that's what I've been documenting, for Mr. Trump's efforts to undo Mr. Obama's environmental legacy. I've been focused broader than that, of course. Experts in environmental law estimate that the Trump administration has now lost about 40 environmental cases in federal courts. Wow. Most immediately, the decision will force the Interior Department to withdraw the waters of the Arctic Ocean from its forthcoming plan detailing where the federal government intends to lease federal waters to oil companies for offshore drilling. A draft of that plan, published last year, called for drilling off the entire United States coastline. The White House referred questions on the matter to the Interior Department, where a spokeswoman declined to comment. And although Friday's court decision relates specifically to a law on offshore drilling, it could also hamstring Mr. Trump's efforts to erase or reduce the creation of a large protected area of public lands by previous presidents. The statutes and the Supreme Court have been silent on the authority of a president to modify or reduce a predecessor's protections of these public lands, waters, and monuments, said Patrick Parenteau. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that near correct, a professor of environmental law at Vermont Law School. But these decisions are showing that if a president wants to reverse a predecessor's environmental policy, they have to give a cogent reason why. Just saying energy dominance is not enough. Saying I won the election is not enough. Professor Parenteau predicted that the case was likely to reach the Supreme Court, though probably not for several years. Both Mr. Obama's efforts to use his executive authority to ban drilling in the Arctic Ocean and Mr. Trump's efforts to undo that ban are legally unprecedented. In using his executive authority to permanently ban drilling in most of the Arctic Ocean, Mr. Obama relied on an obscure provision of a 1953 law, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, which governs how the executive branch uses federal waters for offshore energy exploration. The law includes a provision that lets presidents put those waters off limits to oil and gas drilling. Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard M. Nixon, and Mr. Clinton used the law to protect sections of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans, but those protections came with time limits, usually 1 to 2 decades. In late 2016, as he sought to legally cement environmental protections before Mr. Trump, then the president-elect, took office, Mr. Obama used what both supporters and critics called a creative and unusual interpretation of that law to set a permanent ban on drilling in most of the Arctic Ocean. Fascinating how many hairs there are to split here. 3 months after taking office, Mr. Trump issued an executive order rescinding the ban. That made him the first president to seek to revoke a decision by his predecessor to use the law to protect federal waters. Environmental groups promptly sued the administration over the move, and they welcomed Friday's court decision. Since coming into office, Trump has been on a one-man campaign to undo the work of his predecessor, said Neil Lawrence, a lawyer with the Natural Resources Defense Council, who took part in the oral arguments in the Alaska case. What this opinion confirms is that there are constitutional limits to that. Eric Milito, I'm guessing here, M-I-L-I-T-O, am I seeing this right? It's a hard name to see on screen. A spokesman for the American Petroleum Institute. Boo, I don't know. whatever, which lobbies for the oil industry and which joined the Trump administration's case, said, while we disagree with the decision, our nation still has a significant opportunity before us in the development of the next offshore leasing plan to truly embrace our nation's energy potential and ensure I'm not even going to finish his statement. That's just, you know where the American Petroleum Institute stands on this, yes? Experts said that Judge Gleason's decision could affect the legal outcome of Mr. Trump's efforts to roll back certain protections created by his predecessors on public lands. Just as presidents have used the 1953 offshore drilling law to protect federal waters, they have used a different law, the 1906 Antiquities Act, put in place by President Theodore Roosevelt, to designate and protect millions of acres of lands as permanent public monuments. Presidents throughout the past century have created such monuments, while at least 2 presidents have used their authority to shrink the size of monuments created by their predecessors. Mr. Trump has done so at a more drastic scale. In December of 2017, Mr. Trump cut about 2 million acres from 2 national monuments in Utah, the Bears Ears Monument, created by Mr. Obama, and the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument, created by Mr. Clinton. At the time, it was the largest rollback of federal land protection in the nation's history. Already, lawsuits on the issue are making their way through federal courts. Professor Parenteau and others predicted that Judge Gleason's decision could possibly have a bearing on those cases. That is because, in the language of both laws, Congress gave the president the right to occasionally designate public lands and waters for protection. However, each of the laws is silent on whether a successor can reduce or revoke those protections. Maybe it just never entered their contemplation and anyone ever would. Another one of our shortcomings. Or it's intentional and purposeful, and the answer is no. We contemplated it, and we didn't include it because that's not part of the power. If Mr. Trump's challengers win in court, the decision could affirm future presidents' rights to set bans of offshore drilling that could be undone only by Congress, as opposed to a later president, and similarly could set a precedent that presidential decisions to expand protections of public land could be revised or reversed only by Congress. If Mr. Trump prevails in courts, future presidents could potentially use an executive order to shrink any of the dozens of monuments created by their predecessors, or simply revoke presidential decisions to protect federal waters. So, that's the conclusion of this one article on oil. And now we go a little further afield in Arctic oil in particular, with a really strange entry. This also from the New York Times. How do you like this one? This is really interesting. A key to the Arctic's oil riches lies hidden in Ohio. That does sound weird, doesn't it? And wait till you hear what one of the keys is. This was really amazing. This had never registered with me before. And well, you might be interested in this one. The findings of a test well drilled in Alaska 3 decades ago have been a closely guarded secret. Did you know that? We found answers in a Cleveland courthouse. And it becomes clear why it's in Cleveland pretty shortly. Steve Eder, E-D-E-R, maybe Eder, and Henry Fountain have the byline on this one from April 2nd, New York Times. Working through 2 winters in the biting Arctic cold, roustabouts bored 3 miles deep into the coastal plain of northeast Alaska in search of oil. Now, this is on land, of course. In the spring of 1986, they packed up and left, uttering not a word about what they had found and leaving only a short section of steel pipe to mark the spot. For more than 3 decades, the findings from the $40 million exploratory well have been one of the oil industry's most closely guarded secrets. Outside of the oil giants that paid for it, only a handful of people know what was discovered there. Now, the secret has become much more than a curiosity. The Trump administration, boo, undoing decades of environmental protections, boo, plans to sell drilling leases in the area, which is part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, right? not Anwar Sadat, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and has long been believed to contain North America's biggest untapped onshore trove of oil. We've heard all about it, right, from the oil companies who want to drill there. Anyone interested in drilling in the area urgently wants to know, was the well, the only one ever drilled there, a dry hole or a potential gusher? I didn't even know there was a question. No one will say officially, but the New York Times found an answer in clues hidden 4,000 miles from the Arctic tundra in the archives of a Beaux Arts-style courthouse in Cleveland. The discovery well was worthless, said Sidney B. Silverman, a retired lawyer who was involved in a long-since-forgotten lawsuit filed there in 1987. Mr. Silverman, who's now 86 and divides his time between Long Island and South Florida, reached that conclusion while representing shareholders of Standard Oil of Ohio. That's why we're in Cleveland, as it was being acquired by British Petroleum. Both companies had a stake in the Arctic test well and were poised to benefit from further development. In merger documents, BP had placed only a nominal value on the potential reserves in the refuge, and Mr. Silverman and other lawyers suspected that Standard Oil's shareholders were about to be cheated. Imagine, I don't know what it was like at the time. It was what year was it? I don't know. I guess, when was the lawsuit? 1987. So, it's early on, but I think certainly by that time, I might not have been familiar with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but the idea that Alaska was full of oil was everywhere. Everybody believed that. What if it's just not? How interesting is that? Well, of course, Mr. Silverman here is suing on behalf of Standard Oil shareholders who thought it might very well be full of oil, and they wanted to be paid handsomely for the acquisition of the company since they owned the rights to drill there. But they quickly learned otherwise. The story continues. BP allowed Mr. Silverman to conduct a confidential deposition about the well with a BP executive, David Jenkins. Reached by the Times, Mr. Jenkins said his memories were vague, but he recalled the deposition, which was sealed by the court, and telling Mr. Silverman that, quote, there was never any evidence at all at that stage that there was anything material within the refuge. Mr. Silverman similarly remembered being convinced that either there was no oil and gas there, or the oil couldn't be produced at an economic value. Some of the documents in this case are missing from the court file, perhaps lost over the decades, but in more than 1,000 pages of legal and regulatory filings, the Times discovered other hints that the findings were disappointing. Under oath, a Goldman Sachs banker who worked on the merger testified that BP had led him to believe that the test well results were, quote, not particularly encouraging. John Warden, a lawyer who represented BP, said that he had only dim memories of the case, but that the well results became a non-issue. Told of the Times' reporting, he added, it looks to me like you've gotten it right. Mr. Silverman hinted at the findings in a memoir he self-published 10 years ago, but has never spoken out directly before about what was said in a deposition. He said he was breaking his silence because of the Trump administration's decision to open the refuge, protected by Congress for decades, for oil development. This is important for the whole country, he said. Now, one dry hole does not necessarily mean there is no oil to be found, especially since some decades-old seismic tests indicate that the area may hold as much as 12 billion barrels worth. And knowledge of the area's subsurface geology is valuable, but confirmation that the results of the only test well were discouraging could embolden opponents of the drilling and prompt second thoughts among potential lease bidders. Knowing that information would help you in an extremely competitive bid, said Larry Persili, a former federal gas official responsible for Alaska, who noted there had been billion-dollar lease sales in the state. While the well is all but a pimple on a speck of the Arctic's massive landscape, he said, it is a prevailing mystery, and we love mysteries. Oil and gas development in the Arctic Refuge, or ANWR, A-N-W-R, an expanse about the size of South Carolina that is home to caribou, polar bears, and other wildlife, has been a goal of Republicans in Congress and many Alaskans for half a century. We know this very well. I mean, we've seen it 100 times, right? It's a perennial issue. But efforts to open the refuge's coastal plain, known as the 1002 area, I don't know how they say it, whether 1002, 1002, 1002 area. 1002 seems like the best shorthand. Well, efforts to open this area foundered for years as opponents argued that exploration would irreparably harm one of the country's largest pristine landscapes. Republicans saw an opening with the election of Donald J. Trump. In 2017, the Republican-controlled Congress passed a measure to sell oil leases in the refuge. Since then, the Interior Department has moved rapidly to sell leases for the 1002 area before the 2020 election, when Democrats could regain the White House and block the sales. The exploratory well was drilled under an agreement among BP, Standard Oil, Chevron, and two Alaska Native corporations created to improve economic conditions among the indigenous population. The deal also allowed the oil companies to pursue further exploration on native lands within the 1002 area if the federal government offered leases for the rest of the coastal plain. At a congressional hearing last week, Richard Glenn, an executive with the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, one of the native partners, played down the data's significance. You can't determine the quality of any single basin by one well, he said, and I assume that makes some sense to people. Sounds like it could be true, right? The corporation declined to comment for this article, as did BP. Chevron said in a statement that the results of its activities in the area remained confidential. Joe Balash, the Interior Department official overseeing the leasing efforts, told reporters in December that the potential oil riches should attract plenty of interest despite the enduring mystery surrounding the well, a site known as a tight hole, yow, an industry term for wells with confidential findings. In the oil and gas industry, there's secrets and then there's secrets, Mr. Balash said. This is the tightest hole, I think, that has ever been drilled. Oh, my goodness. Well, okay. Keep your minds out of the gutter, people. This is about oil and gas. The future of our, I don't know. Well, it actually should be the past of our country. Fossil fuels and all that. All right. Let's continue with the next section entitled A Legal Circus. Not illegal circus. There's nothing illegal about it. A legal circus. Got it? A legal circus. Okay, a year after the exploratory well was contemplated, a fleet of lawyers descended upon the Cuyahoga County Courthouse in Cleveland. Sounds like a joke, an alliterative joke. BP, which already held a minority stake in Standard Oil of Ohio, had offered $7.4 billion to buy the rest of it, and the lawyers were there to lodge claims that Standard Oil's shareholders were being shortchanged. The deal and the ensuing litigation led to a legal spectacle, with lawyers, executives, and bankers shuttling from London to New York, often on Concorde jetliners, and then on to Cleveland and California. The case generated financial headlines around the world. Eager to distinguish himself from the other lawyers, Mr. Silverman seized on the lack of detail in BP's offer about what had been found at the test well known as KIC-1. In a filing, he and his team suggested that the omission had led to a significant shortfall in the value of the deal. Soon after, BP's lawyers let Mr. Silverman question Mr. Jenkins, the oil executive. The proceeding was unusually secretive. No copies were made of the transcript, and the original is said to have been stored in a safe at a law firm representing BP. Mr. Jenkins, who is 80, lives near London and still works in the oil industry, said he had found a notation about the meeting in his 1987 appointment book. Wow, he's like Kavanaugh. He did not remember details of the KIC-1 findings, he said, but he recalled that Squee was there. Which, by the way, I've been thinking about Squee. I wonder whether that's Squy, like Squire might be his last name, and he's just abbreviated to Squy, and we've been calling him Squee. But I don't know. I didn't hear him say it. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. He wasn't there, although he did keep detailed day books and appointment books. Anyway, he did not remember details of the findings, but he recalled that there wasn't anything in that well that was particularly encouraging, like oil or gas. Mr. Jenkins holds out the possibility that there is oil in the refuge, but not where the KIC well was drilled, he said. Mr. Silverman, who ultimately agreed to the settlement, said he had been satisfied by what he learned during the deposition. I assure you right now that if the property were valuable, if it had any value, I would not have agreed to that merger. Mr. Silverman and the other lawyers agreed to a small increase in the offer price and BP stock warrants for Standard Oil's shareholders, allowing them to potentially share in future profits. Just as the settlement seemed imminent, lawyers for a large shareholder, the California Public Employees Retirement System, known as CalPERS, lodged a challenge, also asking whether the price reflected the drilling results. To allay those concerns, lawyers for CalPERS were allowed to see information about the well findings. Oh, they get to see it, huh? Oh my goodness, what is this name here? Georgios Apollos, I guess a Greek name. A former California Deputy Attorney General, maybe you know him, who represented CalPERS at the hearing, said that after reviewing a document that showed details of the test well, he concluded, quote, there was no reasonable basis on which to question the fairness of the price. The case was over in about 3 months. Mr. Silverman and the other plaintiff's lawyers shared $22 million in legal fees as they completed one of the era's largest mergers. In the decades since, as the debate flared in Congress over whether to open the refuge to oil exploration, Mr. Silverman and others involved in the case quietly kept the secrets of the test well. To date, there has been no drilling in Anwar. Mr. Silverman wrote in his 2009 memoir, A Happy Life, From Courtroom to Classroom. Environmentalists think their efforts have preserved the wilderness area. He wrote, I know better, but must remain silent. Why? Well, maybe it's in the next section. Keeping the secret. The oil companies drilling KIC-1 were so concerned about secrecy. How concerned were they? They were so concerned about secrecy that, by one industry account, they even shipped the rock cuttings from the well out of Alaska. In 1988, the companies and one of their native corporation partners sued Alaska to keep the well data confidential. After a 4-year legal battle, the sides reached a tentative agreement that would allow only a few state officials to see the findings. But the state wanted to be sure the data was significant enough to warrant concealing it. That, as the companies contended, it would help in valuing subsurface mineral rights nearby. So, Mark Myers, a state petroleum geologist at the time, became one of the few people outside of BP or Chevron to see it. In a conference room at BP's Anchorage offices, Dr. Myers said he was allowed to comb through the information, which included geological and geophysical data from the well. He was not allowed to take notes. When he finished, he reported only that the findings were significant. In what way, we don't know. Since then, the state's files have remained locked away at the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Conservation, yeah, right. In Anchorage. What are they conserving? To this day, Dr. Myers, who went on to lead the United States Geological Survey and Alaska's Department of Natural Resources, now works as a consultant, has not said whether the results were positive or negative, even as many news reports have speculated about them. Proponents of opening the refuge to exploration have long cautioned that the KIC-1 findings are only one data point. While no other wells have been drilled within the refuge, many have been drilled near it. A year after KIC-1 was completed, Tenneco and several partners drilled a well off the coast about 7 miles to the northeast. The well was intended not to discover oil, but to learn more about any potential oil-bearing rock formations. The results were not encouraging, according to Douglas R. Choromansky, who helped analyze data from the well called Aurora. We'll be right back with more after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, entering our last segment for the day and continuing toward the conclusion of this odd New York Times piece. After learning about the well drilled, I guess, to the west of the Anwar Refuge, called Aurora, not encouraging those results. Other wells have been drilled just west of the refuge, closer to the huge oil field at Prudhoe Bay that spurred Alaska's oil boom in the 1970s. Some have tapped into significant oil reserves, some have not. Dr. Myers said that given new understanding of where oil reserves may be found, much of the focus on the refuge has shifted to the western side, away from the KIC-1 well. A 3D seismic testing program has been proposed to help pinpoint any oil reserves in the 1002 area. A full airing of the KIC-1 findings, though, could come if the Interior Department moves forward with selling leases. Under state rules, lease sales near the well are likely to set off a public release of the data. In the meantime, the secrecy surrounding the results and their location remains a source of gossip, rumor, and political intrigue. In February, Alaska's new Republican governor, Mike Dunleavy, fired Hollis French, a Democrat on the state's Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. In a letter the month before, the governor accused Mr. French of several transgressions, including disclosing to a journalist details of where the KIC-1 files were being kept and the protocols for gaining access to them. Mr. French was not accused of revealing the actual data. At a disciplinary hearing, another commissioner, Dan Seamount, said that after he concluded that Mr. French had divulged the data's location, in the dead of night, we moved the information to somewhere more secure. Wow. Fearing that many people wanted to get to the findings and that all it would take would be a bulldozer and 15 minutes. My goodness, you would like bulldoze the office? I guess so. They're learning from the gun thieves, I guess. Whatever happened to the old days of intercepting Mr. Beeks on the train to Philadelphia? My policy is to tell no one where the data reside, not even what country it resides in, Mr. Seamount said, although I think he gave it away by saying he could take care of it in 15 minutes. It's arguably the most valuable well information in the world. Very interesting, and I guess, all in all, what it means is that after all the fighting back and forth over whether or not to open the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve to oil drilling, it may turn out to be the case that there's just nothing in there. You could ruin the whole place for nothing. And in any case, you'd be ruining the whole place for nothing anyway, because, I guess you can't turn your nose up at 12 billion gallons worth of oil, but we need to stop relying on pinning our destiny to finding giant reserves of oil at some point and look towards the future But okay, fine. Am I getting too environmental for you? I hope not. I'm very actually uninvolved in environmental issues, so I thought I would pay attention to this one. I never heard in all this time that there was a study out there that a test well had results. I mean, obviously they're keeping it secret, but the fact that it exists can't be kept secret. But imagine all this time that there was test well results out there that might show that the whole place is empty. And we never even found out about it until now. And this guy almost went to his grave with the information. Very interesting and totally off the beaten path. Thought I would share it with you on a Friday. Okay, back to the realm of the traditionally political for us. Something that I thought you might want to keep in mind for over the weekend, though the pendulum seems to be swinging back in favor of public opinion that the Mueller report will in fact be more damning than the news media might have you believe based on the fan fiction from the Attorney General. I have this piece, which I've been holding for a while, and it's aging at this point. March 24th, right after the Mueller report was released to the Attorney General for him to screw the whole thing up and gaslight us from that point on. But this, a Franklin Foer piece in The Atlantic, the Mueller probe was an unmitigated success, something that I think is important to keep in mind, and I think a good point here. The scandal is how much corruption it exposed and how much turns out to have been perfectly legal. That is an interesting way of looking at things. So much about the rise of Donald Trump defied reason. But in the spring of 2016, he displayed one habit that I found beyond perplexing. He couldn't stop praising Vladimir Putin, and he's never stopped. What made his obsequiousness so galling was that it often came in response to questions that warranted moral disdain. What about the assassination of journalists critical of the Russian government? Are you bothered by the invasion of Crimea? Whereas most of Trump's policy positions shifted over the course of the campaign, his apologetics for Putin were a rare source of constancy. As Trump raced to the Republican nomination, I began to search for ulterior explanations for Trump's adoration of Putin and the fact that his campaign served as a magnet for so many advisors and consultants with ties to Russian interests. On July 4th, 2016, I published a piece in Slate pointing to Putin's pattern of intervening on behalf of candidates hostile to the Western alliance and arguing that we were seeing the same sort of interference unfolding in the United States. And I spent much of the next 3 years trying to understand the nature of that interference. There's the difference between him and the participants in the conversation among the Republican leadership at the time. They, too, noted Putin's pattern of intervening on behalf of candidates hostile to the Western alliance and arguing that we were seeing the same sort of interference unfolding in the United States. And they spent the next 3 years trying to hide that from public view. With tonight's summation, that was of course some weeks ago, of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, there will be a temptation among those who loudly trumpeted this scandal to apologize, and we certainly have seen that. And without a doubt, some Twitter detectives and journalists made mistakes and overshot the evidence. They can apologize, but I won't. Even if the actual Mueller report is anything like the Attorney General's summation of its contents, Russiagate will go down as one of the biggest scandals in American political history. The Mueller investigation has been an unmitigated success in exposing political corruption. In the case of Paul Manafort, the corruption was criminal. In the case of Trump, the corruption doesn't seem to have transgressed any laws. As Michael Kinsley famously quipped, the scandal isn't what's illegal, the scandal is what's legal. Lying to the electorate, adjusting foreign policy for the sake of personal lucre, and undermining an investigation seem to me pretty sound impeachable offenses. They might also happen to be technically legal. Through his investigation, Mueller has also provided a plausible answer to the question that first bothered me. Trump's motive for praising Putin appears to have been, in large part, commercial. With his relentless pursuit of Trump Tower Moscow, the Republican nominee for president had active commercial interests in Russia that he failed to disclose to the American people. In fact, he explicitly and shamelessly lied about them. As Trump's former personal attorney Michael Cohen implied in his congressional testimony, Trump ran his campaign as something of an infomercial, hoping to convince the Russians that he was a good partner. To enrich himself, Trump promised to realign American foreign policy. This is the very definition of corruption, and it provides the plotline that runs through the entirety of Trump's political life. The president never chooses to distinguish, and indeed may be temperamentally incapable of distinguishing, his personal interests from the national interest. Why has he failed so consistently to acknowledge Russian interference in the election? Because that interference was designed to benefit him. Why did he fire James Comey and, let's use the word, obstruct the investigation into election interference? Because he wanted to protect himself from any investigation that might turn up material that reflected badly on him and his circle. And whatever Mueller's ultimate conclusion about collusion, his investigation has proved to be an unending source of damning revelations about the president and the men who constituted his closest advisors. Along with Trump's stalwart defenders, many left-wing critics of hawkish foreign policy have been quick to tout Attorney General William Barr's letter as exoneration. Matt Taibbi has compared the coverage of the Russia scandal to the media's gullible reporting about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The accusation is that the media are prone to parrot whatever self-serving conspiracy the national security state has to offer. But Mueller has apparently endorsed the fundamental underlying case emanating from the intelligence community. The Russians were actively working to secure Trump's victory. What makes their interference so horrifying is that it involved the theft of information and the active manipulation of public perceptions. All of that is arguably far worse than Watergate. But Trump makes for a slippery figure to study, and here's why Taibbi's WMD analogy isn't entirely wrong. Just as Saddam Hussein acted as if he possessed verboten weaponry, everything about Trump's behavior suggested that he was guilty of instances of collusion worse than anything the public could observe. That's undoubtedly a major reason so many intelligence community honchos were so worried. The other reason, which Barr cited again today, a few days ago, of course, is that the Russians were actively seeking a partnership with the campaign. That such a partnership never materialized is a relief, if that's actually the case. But the fact that we're not staring at the worst case scenario of guilt is hardly a reason for giving the president any credit. And there's almost never a reason for that. All right, let's see if I can't fit in one more story here before things close out for the week. I have something I've been holding on to for a little bit here from the Daily Beast also. Bezos investigation finds the Saudis obtained his private data. This is written by the private investigator that Jeff Bezos hired to look into this whole strange breach of his privacy, however it may have happened. Gavin DeBecker, published on the 30th of March. The National Enquirer's lawyer, he says, tried to get me to say there was no hacking. Another interesting twist and turn of events in this weird story. It goes like this. For 40 years, I've advised at-risk public figures and government agencies on high-stakes security matters. My career has included working with the CIA, FBI, at the Reagan White House, counseling foreign leaders, and advising on controversial murder cases. I've seen a lot. And yet, I've recently seen things that have surprised even me, such as the National Enquirer's parent company, AMI, being in league with a foreign nation that's been actively trying to harm American citizens and companies, including the owner of the Washington Post. You know him as Jeff Bezos. I know him as my client of 22 years, and also Jeff Bezos. But okay. To understand where this story goes, some background is needed. Play some background sounding music in your head, and here we go. Wayne's World. Maybe that will do the trick. In January, the National Enquirer published a special edition that revealed an intimate relationship Bezos was having. He asked me to learn who provided his private texts to the Enquirer and why. My office quickly identified the person whom the Enquirer had paid as a source, a man named Michael Sanchez, the now estranged brother of Lauren Sanchez, whom Bezos was dating. What was unusual, very unusual, was how hard AMI people worked to publicly reveal their source's identity. First, through strong hints they gave me, "Psst, it was Michael Sanchez," stuff like that. And later through direct statements, like, "It was Michael Sanchez." AMI practically pinned a kick me sign on Michael Sanchez. It was not the White House. It was not Saudi Arabia, a company lawyer said on national television before telling us more. It was a person that was known to both Bezos and Ms. Sanchez. In case even more was needed, he added, any investigator that was going to investigate this knew who the source was. A very helpful hint, since the name of who was being investigated had been made public 10 days earlier in a Daily Beast report. Much was made about a recent front-page story in the Wall Street Journal fingering Michael Sanchez as the Inquirer's source, but that information was first published almost 7 weeks ago by the Daily Beast after multiple sources inside AMI told the Daily Beast the exact same thing. The actual news in the Journal article was that its reporters were able to confirm a claim Michael Sanchez had been making. It was the Inquirer who first contacted him about the affair, not the other way around. That does seem like it stands it all on its head. AMI has repeatedly insisted they had only one source on their Bezos story, but the Journal reports that when the Inquirer began conversations with Michael Sanchez, they had, quote, already been investigating whether Mr. Bezos and Ms. Sanchez were having an affair. Michael Sanchez has since confirmed to Page 6 that when the Inquirer contacted him back in July, they had already seen text exchanges between the couple. If accurate, the Wall Street Journal and Page 6 stories would mean, clearly and obviously, that the initial information came from other channels, another source or method. And there's an editor's statement inserted here that on Sunday, after the publication of this story, AMI issued a statement insisting that, quote, it was Michael Sanchez who tipped the National Enquirer off to the affair on September 10th, 2018, and over the course of 4 months provided all the materials for our investigation. There is a linked statement on that provided here as well. Reality is complicated and can't always be boiled down to a simple narrative like the brother did it, even when that brother is a person who certainly supplied some information to a supermarket tabloid, and even when that brother is an associate of Roger Stone and Carter Page. Though interesting, it turns out those truths are also too simple. Though I guess AMI is denying it and says he came to them. Very interesting still. Why did AMI's people work so hard to identify a source and insist to the New York Times and others that he was their sole source for everything? My best answer is contained in what happened next. AMI threatened to publish embarrassing photos of Jeff Bezos unless certain conditions were met. We can understand what those conditions might be, but check out some of the rest of the stuff. These were photos that, for some reason, they had held back and not published in their first story on the Bezos affair or any subsequent story. While a brief summary of those terms has been made public before, others that I'm sharing are new, and they reveal a great deal about what was motivating AMI. An 8-page contract AMI sent me and Bezos for us to sign would have required that I make a public statement composed by them and then widely disseminated, saying that my investigation had concluded that they hadn't relied upon, quote, any form of electronic eavesdropping or hacking in their news-gathering process, unquote. Note here that I'd never publicly said anything about electronic eavesdropping or hacking, and they wanted to be sure I couldn't. They also wanted me to say our investigation had concluded that their Bezos story was not, quote, instigated, dictated, or influenced in any manner by external forces, political or otherwise. External forces? Such a strange phrase. AMI knew these statements did not reflect my conclusions because I told AMI's chief content officer, Dylan Howard, in a 90-minute recorded phone call that what they were asking me to say about external forces and hacking, quote, is not my truth, unquote, and would be just echoing what you are looking for. Indeed, an earlier set of their proposed terms included AMI making a statement, quote, affirming that it undertook no electronic eavesdropping in connection with its reporting and has no knowledge of such conduct, unquote. But now they wanted me to say that for them. The contract further held that if Bezos or I were ever in our lives to state, suggest, or allude to anything contrary to what AMI wanted said about electronic eavesdropping and hacking, then they could publish the embarrassing photos. I'm writing this today because it's exactly what the Inquirer scheme was intended to prevent me from doing. Their contract also contained terms that would have inhibited both me and Bezos from initiating a report to law enforcement. Things didn't work out as they hoped. When the terms for avoiding publication of personal photos were presented to Jeff Bezos, he responded immediately, no thank you. Within hours, he wrote an essay describing his reasons for rejecting AMI's threatening proposal. Then he posted it all on Medium, including AMI's actual emails and their salacious description of private photos. After the Medium post, AMI put up a limp statement saying it believed fervently that it acted lawfully in the reporting of the story of Mr. Bezos. The issues Bezos raised in his Medium post have nothing whatsoever to do with Michael Sanchez, any more than revealing the name of a low-level Watergate burglar sheds light on the architects of the Watergate cover-up. Bezos was not expressing concerns about the Inquirer's original story. He was focused on what he called extortion and blackmail. Next, Bezos directed me to spend whatever is needed, that must have sounded great, to learn who may have been complicit in the scheme and why they did it. That investigation is now complete. As has been reported elsewhere, my results have been turned over to federal officials. Since it is now out of my hands, I intend today's writing to be my last public statement on the matter. Further, to respect officials pursuing this case, I won't disclose details from our investigation. I am, however, comfortable confirming at least one key fact. Our investigators and several experts concluded with high confidence that the Saudis had access to Bezos' phone and gained private information. As of today, or at least as of the writing, it is unclear to what degree, if any, AMI was aware of the details. We did not reach our conclusions lightly. The inquiry included a broad array of resources, investigative interviews with current and former AMI executives and sources, extensive discussions with top Middle East experts in the intelligence community, leading cybersecurity experts who have tracked Saudi spyware, discussions with current and former advisors to President Trump, Saudi whistleblowers, people who personally know the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS, people who work with his close associate, Saud al-Qahtani, Saudi dissidents, and other targets of Saudi action, including writer and activist Iyad el-Baghdadi. Experts with whom we consulted confirmed New York Times reports on the Saudi capability to, quote, collect vast amounts of previously inaccessible data from smartphones in the air without leaving a trace, including phone calls, texts, and emails, unquote, and confirmed that hacking was a key part of the Saudis' extensive surveillance efforts that ultimately led to the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Some Americans will be surprised to learn that the Saudi government has been intent on harming Jeff Bezos since last October, when the Post began its relentless coverage of Khashoggi's murder. The Saudi campaign against Bezos has already been reported by CNN International, Bloomberg, The Daily Beast, and others. Saudi Arabia attacks people in many ways, obviously, including through their elaborate social media program that uses sophisticated technology and paid surrogates to create artificially trending hashtags. To give you an idea of how this program has infected the U.S., the New York Times reported that the Saudis even had an operative inside Twitter, which fired the suspect employee and later advised select activists and others that, quote, your Twitter account is one of a small group of accounts that may have been targeted by state-sponsored actors, unquote. I believe we've heard that somewhere before. In October, the Saudi government unleashed its cyber army on Bezos and later me. Their multi-pronged campaign included public calls for boycotts against Amazon.com and its Saudi subsidiary Souq.com, S-O-U-Q. Just 3 examples among thousands, and there's some block quote here. We as Saudis will never accept to be attacked by the Washington Post in the morning, only to buy products from Amazon and Souq.com by night. Strange that all 3 companies are owned by the same Jew who attacks us by day and sells us products by night. Our weapon is to boycott, because the owner of the newspaper is the same as their owner. Their owner, that is. Okay, so in other words, reminding you that Amazon and Souq are owned by the Washington Post. We're after you, the Jew. That's what it says. Worshipper of money, gee whiz, who will go bankrupt by the will of God at the hands of Saudi Arabia. The owner of Amazon and Souq is the owner of the Washington Post, and is the spiteful Jew who insults us every day. Gee whiz, I thought they got comfortable with the Jews and Israelis. I guess not. By the way, Bezos, not Jewish, but you get the point. We studied the well-documented and close relationship between MBS and AMI Chairman David Pecker. That alliance includes David Pecker bringing MBS intermediary Casey Grine to a private White House meeting with President Trump and Jared Kushner. Pecker, who has also traveled to Saudi Arabia to meet the Crown Prince. Though we don't know what was discussed in those private meetings, AMI's actions afterwards are telling. To coincide with MBS's March 2018 U.S. tour, AMI created a 100-page, ad-free, glossy magazine called The New Kingdom. We've heard about that one. Since MBS wasn't yet a notorious figure in the West, this was before the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, AMI's magazine introduced him to Americans as, quote, the most influential Arab leader transforming the world at 32 and improving the lives of his people in hopes for peace. The Associated Press reported that AMI sent an advanced digital copy of their laudatory magazine to the Saudi embassy 3 weeks before printing and distributing 200,000 issues. Despite AP's substantial forensic evidence, the kingdom denied it received the magazine's content in advance. While we're on denials, the kingdom says Saudi Arabia had nothing to do with the Bezos matter. The kingdom also says MBS had nothing whatsoever to do with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. When AMI publicly insisted that nobody outside of their executives and editors had any influence on this publication or its content, I guess they meant, other than Casey Grine, the very same MBS intermediary Pecker had brought to the White House. I say that because AMI soon had to disclose to the Department of Justice National Security Division that their mystery magazine included content written by Grine, and that they also gave him the whole working draft for advance review, and that he suggested changes, and they implemented his changes, and that he provided better photographs of MBS. With friends like AMI, you don't need publicists. My firm has done many investigations into Inquirer misconduct, including one that became the subject of a 60 Minutes investigative piece way back in 1990. Before then, tabloids had been seen as almost funny publications, mixing celebrity gossip with space aliens and Elvis sightings. But when the Inquirer's on-again, off-again relationship with the truth percolated into politics, it wasn't so funny anymore. Though relatively benign at first, Al Gore's diet is making him stupid, for instance, headlines like that, the Trump-Pecker relationship has metastasized. In effect, the Inquirer became an enforcement arm of the Trump presidential campaign and presidency, as the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York laid out in its case against Michael Cohen, who has pleaded guilty. The U.S. Attorney has done the country a service by levying extensive controls on AMI, David Pecker, and his deputy, Dylan Howard, through a non-prosecution agreement that requires them to commit no other crimes for 3 years and requires everyone at AMI to attend annual training on federal election laws. I'm guessing that's not how they used to spend their time. All right, well, we've got to wrap it up at this point, and it's just very close to the end of the article. I don't think I'll fit all of the rest of it in, but I do want to note that, for the record, he sums it up this way, saying that things have changed at the Inquirer since the 90s, and they have become a little bit more sophisticated and involved even to the point into secretly entangling with a nation state that's using its enormous resources to harm American citizens and companies. Well, that's a pretty considerable departure from where they used to be. For the Saudi side of the equation, not only does the kingdom have a close alliance with AMI, which owns the Inquirer, Us Weekly, The Star, Globe, Radar Online, and many other publications, but the Saudis have pursued investments and partnerships involving Rolling Stone, Variety, Deadline, The Robb Report, and National Geographic, among others. Unlike these publications, it's clear that MBS considers the Washington Post to be a major enemy. Saudi Arabia is hardly the first repressive regime that seeks total control of the news media in its own country, wanting to control the media in the United States, and using any means to do so will hopefully prove to be an overreach. Well, I hope so. That concludes things for today and for the week. We'll be back on Monday, maybe with a full report of how things went over the weekend, maybe not. In the meantime, stay tuned for Justice Putnam next with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy right here on Netroots Radio. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
From Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.